When Albert Einstein died, the world did not just lose a genius. It began a 70-year search inside his stolen brain for an answer that may never have been there. Albert Einstein died on April 18, 1955, in Princeton, New Jersey, after a fatal aneurysm. He had been clear about what he wanted after death. He did not want a shrine. He did not want a grave turned into a pilgrimage site. His body was supposed to be cremated, his ashes scattered, and the man himself allowed to disappear. But one thing did not disappear with him. During the autopsy, pathologist Thomas Harvey removed Einstein's brain and kept it aside. That single act turned a private death into one of science's strangest afterlives. And that is where the myth really begins. Because once the brain was separated from the body, it stopped being an organ and became something else. A relic, a clue, maybe even a promise. If Einstein had changed physics, if he had bent the way humanity understood space, time, light, and reality, then surely the machinery behind all that brilliance had to look different. Surely genius, at some level, had a shape. That belief sounds almost unavoidable now. But it was also the first trap. Harvey later secured permission from Einstein's son Hans Albert to retain the brain for scientific study, and from that point on, the brain entered a strange medical limbo. Harvey was not a major neuroscience figure. He was the pathologist who happened to be there. Yet he found himself in possession of the single most coveted brain in the world. He lost his job at Princeton Hospital not long after, and over the years, the brain traveled with him. Cut into sections, stored in jars, carried across states, and distributed in pieces to selected researchers. For decades, the most famous brain on Earth lived less like a sacred object in a grand institution than like a secret being passed hand to hand. And the deeper you look at that image, the stranger it becomes. Because hidden inside it is a huge assumption. Not just that Einstein was extraordinary. Almost everyone agrees he was. The assumption was that extraordinary thought must leave behind extraordinary structure, that if a mind changes history, then the tissue itself must contain the mark of that difference, waiting for someone disciplined enough to find it. That was the wager. It was a very 20th century wager, too. Measure it, slice it, compare it, turn mystery into anatomy, reduce brilliance to structure. If the answer could not be found in biography, education, culture, or obsession, then maybe it could be found under glass. Maybe genius, in the end, was something physical enough to point at. So the search began with enormous confidence. But confidence is not evidence. What Harvey preserved was not some glowing biological signature. Einstein's brain weight was unexceptional. His cortex showed age-related features that were not shocking for a man of his years. And even before later researchers tried to draw larger conclusions from microscopic fragments and photographs, the material itself already carried limitations. Some methods that might have been more revealing were difficult or impossible because of how the tissue had been processed. In other words, the hunt began not with a perfect key, but with damaged access to a legend. That matters because it changes the tone of the whole story. The popular version says scientists stole Einstein's brain to uncover the secret of genius. The more honest version is harsher. They stole Einstein's brain because they believed genius had to be hiding somewhere inside it, and once that belief took hold, nearly every unusual fold or cell count risked looking more meaningful than it really was. That does not mean the researchers were foolish. It means they were human. They were staring at the brain of Albert Einstein. No object on that table could have arrived with more expectation attached to it. And expectation has a way of shaping what people think they see. So before we get to the DNA, before we get to ancient lineages and the much older story waiting behind Einstein's name, we have to sit with this first chapter honestly. A world-famous brain was removed against Einstein's original wishes. It was preserved, divided, mailed, guarded, studied, and mythologized. And for all the reverence around it, the search had a quiet weakness at its center from the very beginning. It may have been chasing the wrong question. because in the years ahead, scientists would keep looking at Einstein's brain and keep hoping anatomy would finally explain the man. But the longer that search continued, the more uncomfortable the pattern became. The brain was producing fascination, not answers. The brain was producing fascination, not answers. And yet that did not slow the story down. It accelerated it. Because once Einstein's brain had been broken into slides, fragments, photographs, and numbered tissue blocks, each new paper could arrive with the same irresistible suggestion. Maybe this time, finally, someone had found the physical mark of genius. That is how the neuromythology formed. Not through one giant fraud, not through one giant lie, through a long chain of mabes that sounded, in public retelling, more certain than they really were. One of the earliest famous claims came in 1985, when Marion Diamond and colleagues reported an unusual neuron-to-glia pattern in parts of Einstein's cortex compared with a small control group. The result drew enormous attention because glial cells were increasingly understood not as passive support tissue, but as active participants in brain function. So the public translation was immediate and seductive. Einstein had more of the brain's support cells, and maybe that helped explain exceptional intelligence. But even there, the finding was narrow, based on limited samples, and later methodological criticism made those older counting approaches look far less secure than they sounded in headlines. Then came the next layer of intrigue. Researchers pointed to the inferior parietal regions, areas often associated with mathematical reasoning, spatial thought, and certain kinds of abstraction. A 1999 study argued that parts of Einstein's inferior parietal lobules were unusually configured and expanded. Years later, additional photo-based analyses argued for unusual folding patterns in the prefrontal and parietal cortex, and another paper suggested an unusually robust corpus callosum, the bridge connecting the two hemispheres. One by one, these details built a powerful public image. A brain that looked subtly, but meaningfully, engineered for extraordinary thinking. Now here is the important part. None of those claims were automatically absurd. Some were careful. Some were genuinely interesting. Some may still matter as anatomical observations. The problem was what happened next. The observations did not stay small. They did not stay tentative. They got absorbed into a much bigger cultural hunger. Each unusual fold, each asymmetry, each dense patch of tissue was treated less like an isolated clue and more like a nearly solved equation. And that leap from unusual to therefore explanatory is exactly where the story starts to wobble. Because unusual compared to what? That question haunted almost every stage of this research. Control groups were often small. Einstein was elderly. Individual brains vary more than people tend to imagine. Post-mortem handling introduced limitations. Different studies looked at different regions with different methods, chasing different kinds of significance. And the more papers appeared, the easier it became to treat a scattered pile of interesting anatomical details as if they were all pointing to one clear conclusion. They were not. This is why the phrase neuromythology matters so much. A myth is not always something invented from nothing. Sometimes it is something assembled from fragments of truth, then polished until uncertainty disappears. That is what happened here. Einstein's brain became a screen people projected onto. If they wanted proof that genius is physically built, they could find it. If they wanted proof that great intellect must leave a visible trace, they could find that too. The legend grew not because the evidence was overwhelmingly strong, but because the desire for that evidence was overwhelmingly strong. And eventually, some researchers said the quiet part out loud. A major 2014 review took the existing literature head-on and concluded that the studies did not support the claim that the structure of Einstein's brain reflected his intellectual abilities. A 2018 review reached a similar destination, arguing that the reported anatomical oddities could not be tied in any secure way to his brilliance. That does not erase every observation, but it does change the whole balance of the story. What the public had been hearing as a slow accumulation of proof looked, under review, more like a famous object surrounded by interpretive overreach. And that is the turning point. Not because the brain studies were worthless. They were not. They tell us something about scientific curiosity, about anatomy, about post-mortem research, and about the risks of studying a once-in-history figure under a spotlight bright enough to distort judgment. But they did not deliver what the world wanted most. They did not isolate a physical secret of Einstein. They did not reduce genius to tissue. They did not close the case. If you like stories where one great mystery slowly turns into a critique of how we chase answers, subscribe now, because this is where the investigation stops being about a famous brain and starts becoming much stranger. Because once the anatomy hunt began to fall apart, a different path opened. A narrower path in one sense, but a deeper one in another. Instead of asking what Einstein's brain looked like, some researchers and genealogists asked a much simpler question. What if the more revealing clue was not hidden in preserved tissue at all but in a single line of inherited DNA? What if the more revealing clue was not hidden in preserved tissue at all but in a single line of inherited DNA? That sounds like an even stranger turn in the story. After all, a brain is the organ people associate with intelligence. A Y chromosome is not. It does not contain some secret code for genius, and it was never going to answer the question people had forced onto Einstein's brain. But that is exactly why this chapter matters. It did not try to solve the same mystery better. It changed the mystery entirely. Because the Y chromosome does one very specific thing, and that specificity is what makes it useful here. In males, it passes down the direct paternal line, father to son, with relatively little recombination compared with most of the genome. That means it can function like a very narrow historical thread, not a full portrait of ancestry, not a map of everything a person is, just one line, one branch, one inheritance channel running backward through generations. And notice how different that is from the brain hunt. The brain hunt was broad, almost greedy. It wanted a total explanation. It wanted to hold genius in its hands and point to the fold, the cell count, the asymmetry that made Albert Einstein, Albert Einstein. eDNA does not even try to do that. It asks a smaller question. What direct paternal lineage was this person part of? That narrower question is humbler. But sometimes a humbler question gets further. That is the first real reversal in this whole story. Now, there is an important caution here. The public Einstein Y-DNA claim does not come from sequencing Einstein's own remains. What exists publicly is an Einstein surname Y-DNA project that displays results from tested men in the paternal Einstein line. In genealogy circles, that line is often associated with haplogroup E, and often discussed more specifically in relation to EZ830 or nearby branches. But even genealogy references that discuss this claim also note that the exact assignment has been treated as debated. So this is best narrated as a lineage clue with caveats, not as an absolute final verdict carved in stone. That distinction matters a lot, because if this chapter is told carelessly, it becomes just another myth. First, the myth that genius must be visible in brain tissue. Then the myth that genius must be encoded in a paternal haplogroup. But a haplogroup is not a talent. It is not intelligence. It is not destiny. It is simply a label used to place one paternal line on the branching tree of human ancestry. That makes it historically powerful and biologically limited at the same time. And that combination, powerful but limited, is exactly why it is more trustworthy than the old fantasy of finding Einstein-ness under a microscope. So the real shock here is not that DNA solved genius. It is that DNA refused to play that game. The Y chromosome approach did something smarter. It stepped around the impossible question and asked one that could actually be traced. Not, why was Einstein brilliant? But what ancient paternal line did he belong to? Once you hear the question that way, the whole emotional temperature changes. We are no longer standing over a preserved organ waiting for a miracle. We are following a thread backward through fathers, grandfathers, and much older populations into places history books do not usually connect to Einstein at all. And this is where the story gets more interesting than the brain ever allowed it to be. Because a preserved brain keeps the mystery trapped in one lifetime, one body, one celebrity, one attempt to explain one extraordinary man. A paternal lineage does the opposite. It dissolves the individual into a much longer chain. It does not tell you why Einstein thought the way he did, but it does tell you that he stood inside a line of inheritance far older than modern Europe, far older than the 19th century, far older even than the scientific world that later turned him into an icon. That is the second reversal. The old search wanted something intimate and personal. What was special about his brain? The newer search delivers something almost impersonal. Your story is bigger than you. Your line reaches into populations that lived thousands of years before your language, religion, nationality, or name existed. And once that shift happens, the Einstein mystery stops being a forensic puzzle and starts turning into a deep history story. A story about where a lineage appears in the ancient record. A story about the Levant. A story about a population living near the threshold where hunting, gathering, settlement, and early cultivation begin to blur into something new. So this is the point where the camera needs to lift, away from Princeton, away from the autopsy table, away from the glass slides and the jars. Because the question has changed now, completely. And once it changes, the timeline changes with it. Not decades, not centuries, 12,000 years. Not decades, not centuries, 12,000 years. That is the scale change hidden inside the DNA chapter. Once the story stops asking whether Einstein's preserved brain contained a visible mark of genius, it starts moving backward into a much older landscape, the ancient Levant, before states, before empires, before written history, near the threshold where settled life begins to harden into something new. Ancient DNA work on the Near East includes Natufian hunter-gatherers dating to about 12,000 years ago. And that is where the Einstein lineage story starts sounding less like celebrity science and more like human prehistory. Now, this is the point where a lot of retellings get too neat. The viral version says modern testing bypassed Einstein's brain, identified haplogroup EZ830, and matched him directly to the Natufians, the people who built civilization. It is a great line. It is also cleaner than the evidence really is. The public Einstein surname Y-DNA project does point to paternal line results inside haplogroup E, with at least one project member shown as SNP confirmed and others listed under broader EM35 level assignments. But even genealogy references that discuss Einstein as EZ830 describe that exact placement as debatable rather than settled fact. And strangely, that does not make the story weaker. It makes it better, because the stronger version is not Einstein's DNA solved Einstein. The stronger version is that a cautious paternal line clue places the story in the same broad deep time corridor where ancient Levantine populations, including the Tufians, carried haplogroup E lineages as well. In the 2016 Nature study on the ancient Near East, Lazaridis and colleagues reported genome-wide DNA from Natufian hunter-gatherers and concluded that Natufians and successor Levantine Neolithic populations carried haplogroup E. A later 2022 phylogenetic placement paper further described Levantine Natufians as carrying E1b, 1b, 1b2 lineages. That is not the same as proving a simple one-to-one identity with Einstein's exact downstream branch. But it does place the Einstein paternal line story in a very old Levant-linked genetic landscape. And that landscape matters, because the Natufians are fascinating even before genetics enters the picture. Archaeologically, they are known as late Epipaleolithic people of the Levant who were mainly hunter-gatherers, but not in the old image of endlessly wandering bands. Some groups lived in caves. Others occupied incipient villages. They harvested wild grain, used sickles, mortars, and pestles, and are often described as largely sedentary or semi-sedentary before agriculture was fully developed in the region. In other words, they stood very close to one of the great turning points in human history without yet being reducible to the simple label, farmers. That distinction is important because this chapter is not impressive only if the Natufians can be called the first farmers. The real significance is broader. The 2016 ancient DNA study found continuity between pre-farming hunter-gatherers and early farmers in the Near East. In the southern Levant, the first farmers were not just a foreign population arriving and replacing everyone. They descended substantially from local hunter-gatherers, and the study estimates that Levantine first farmers traced about 2/3 of their ancestry to people related to Natufian hunter-gatherers. So the Natufian world sits close to the transition, where settled life, cultivation, and farming societies begin to emerge from older local populations. And now the Einstein story changes again. Because once you place it there, the emotional meaning is no longer about inherited brilliance. It is about continuity, about how one thin paternal line can survive through migrations, religious change, language change, political upheaval, and the entire collapse and rebuilding of worlds. The man who became a symbol of modern theoretical thought belonged, at least in the public genealogy version of this story, to a paternal tradition tied to a branch of humanity far older than modern Europe and possibly connected to the same broader Levantine paternal horizon seen in ancient Natufian remains. But this is exactly where the old mistake tries to come back, because the moment people hear Einstein and ancient lineage in the same sentence, the temptation is obvious. To turn ancestry into explanation. To imagine that somewhere inside that deep paternal branch is the reason he saw what others did not, the reason he could think and thought experiments that bent the universe, the reason his name still means genius. But that is just the brain myth in a new costume. A haplogroup can tell a story about descent. It cannot tell the story of intellect, character, education, obsession, or originality. So the deep reveal is not that Einstein's DNA solved the mystery of genius. It is that the better question produced a different kind of wonder. The brain hunt kept trying to make Einstein smaller, to compress him into tissue, into folds, into a specimen. The lineage story does the opposite. It dissolves the individual into prehistory. It puts him inside a chain that reaches back toward ancient Levantine hunter-gatherers living near the edge of settlement and the dawn of farming societies. That is not an answer to genius. It is something stranger and maybe more human. A reminder that even the most singular people arrive carrying histories far older than themselves. And once you see that, the final question is no longer where Einstein came from. It is why we were so desperate to believe that one organ or one lineage label could ever fully explain him. It is why we were so desperate to believe that one organ or one lineage label could ever fully explain him. Because once you strip away the headlines, that is the real ending of the Einstein mystery. Not that scientists finally located the secret of genius in a preserved brain. Not that a Y chromosome branch unlocked some hidden inheritance formula. But that one of the most famous scientific obsessions of the modern era reveals something uncomfortable about us. We do not like brilliance when it feels too large, too human, or too complicated. We want to shrink it until it fits inside something we can point to. A fold in the cortex, a ratio of cells, a branch on a paternal tree. Something visible, something measurable, something that makes greatness feel less mysterious. An Einstein story would not cooperate. For decades, researchers looked at pieces of his brain and proposed intriguing anatomical differences. Some papers argued for unusual structure in regions tied to mathematical or spatial reasoning. Others pointed to patterns in support cells or interhemispheric connections. But major reviews later argued that the overall body of evidence did not justify the claim that Einstein's brain structure explained his intellectual abilities. The studies were interesting. The mythology built around them was much bigger. Then the story moved to the Y chromosome, and that shift matters because it changed what could honestly be known. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son and can be used to trace one direct paternal line through time. That makes it useful for ancestry and population history, but narrow by design. It can place a lineage on the human tree, It cannot explain imagination, originality, discipline, obsession, or thought. It cannot tell you why one person sees what millions of others never do. That is why the deep history reveal feels so powerful. Not because it solves Einstein, but because it places him inside something older than biography. Ancient DNA work in the Near East shows that Natufian hunter-gatherers were part of the population history that fed into later Levantine farming groups, with Levantine first farmers tracing roughly 2/3 of their ancestry to people related to Natufians. So when the public Einstein lineage story is linked to that broader Levantine paternal horizon, the real effect is not a genetic explanation of genius, it is a scale shift. Einstein stops being only a 20th century icon and becomes one visible point in a much longer human chain. And maybe that is the better kind of wonder. Because the stolen brain story is, at its core, a story of reduction. A world-famous mind is turned into tissue, into slides, into fragments in jars, into an object people hope will surrender its secret under enough scrutiny. The lineage story does the opposite. It expands. It reminds us that even the most singular life arrives out of countless prior lives, most of them forgotten, none of them knowing what would come later. One path tries to compress Einstein into a specimen. The other dissolves him into history. But even that larger view has a boundary, and the boundary is important. Ancestry is not destiny. Lineage is not intellect. A haplogroup is not a talent. If we say otherwise, we are not escaping the old myth. We are just dressing it in newer language. The same mistake returns with fresh vocabulary. The fantasy that genius must be inherited in some neat, readable form, waiting for science to expose it. Einstein's story resists that temptation twice. First, when the brain hunt fails to deliver a clean answer. Then again, when paternal ancestry widens the story without ever becoming an explanation for his mind. So what did DNA really solve here? Not the mystery of intelligence, not the origin of genius. What it solved, at least in part, was the illusion that the old hunt had been asking the right question. The wrong question was, where is Einstein's genius hiding inside the body? The better question was, what kinds of things can biology actually reveal, and what kinds of stories are we forcing it to tell? That is a very different ending from the one people expect when they click on Einstein, DNA, and ancient civilization in the same title. It is less magical maybe, less convenient, but it is also more honest and, in the end, more interesting. Because the final lesson is not that Einstein's body gave up its secret. It is that the search for his secret exposed the limits of our own imagination. We wanted genius to be visible. We wanted it to be traceable. We wanted it to be inherited in a way that felt satisfying. Instead, all the evidence kept pushing in the same direction. A brain can be studied. A lineage can be traced. But a human mind, especially one that changes the world, will always be larger than the labels we try to trap it in. And maybe that was the answer hiding in this story from the beginning. Not that Einstein was beyond biology, but that biology was never going to be enough.